Hello, this is Timothy Snider. I'm a historian, and I'm very honored to have been asked to speak to you today. I've decided that what I would do in honor of the festival and the cause is to talk in English about some things that probably everyone in Crimea, from Crimea, knows, but which perhaps other people around the world don't, which have to do with the history of the colonization, the history of the Russian Empire in Crimea, the history of empire in general in Crimea. I'm thinking about all of this because I'm thinking about the Kerch Bridge. I'm thinking about the Crimea Bridge, which for me is a kind of ecological monstrosity. There's no reason for that bridge to be there. Crimea is connected very well to Ukraine. Water and electricity and everything else can flow from Ukraine to Crimea. There's no reason for that bridge. And of course, it's also an imperial monstrosity. It's a demonstration of imperial power. It's meant to be a demonstration of Putin's personal imperial power. And when I look at that bridge and I think about the explosion on the bridge, I can't help but think of the two very different visions for the future of Crimea, which one hears from the Russian side and the Ukrainian side. On the Russian side, the vision is one of empire, more naval bases, more police state, more oppression of the indigenous population. From the Ukrainian side, the ideas are things like demilitarization, a national park, and rights for the indigenous people of the peninsula. Very different models. And I've been thinking about Crimea as well because living in the United States, living in the West, I realized that a lot of people here somehow think that the war in Crimea in 2014 is different from the war in 2022. And of course, in some ways, it is different. There's a fundamental similarity, which is that it was an imperial war, and it was based on a fundamentally mistaken idea. Many people in the West don't realize that the referendum in Crimea in 2014 was just as much a fake as the referenda that were supposedly just held in eastern Ukraine. Many people don't realize that those referenda were also held under gunpoint, that the questions in those referenda didn't make sense, and that a very small number of people actually took part. In other words, people who recognize that the war in Ukraine is wrong now may not always recognize that the war in Crimea in 2014 was wrong in the same way. But for me, the explosions on the Kerch Bridge are a reminder of all that was wrong with the Russian invasion, all that is wrong with the Russian imperialism in Crimea. And what I'd like to do in this lecture is just say a few words to people who may not know very much about it, about the history of this empire. So there's a kind of magic that imperialists perform where they say something has always been ours. And by always, what they mean is since yesterday. Moscow talks about Crimea in this way, talks about Ukraine in this way, and it's equally wrong. The history of the Crimean Peninsula involves the history of a state, the history of the Crimean Khanate, a Crimean state which existed for 6 centuries, a couple as part of a larger Mongol state, 4 centuries on its own. When this state, which was a descendant of the Mongol state, which incorporated the local Kuman, local Turkic-speaking people, was absorbed by the Russian Empire in the late 18th century, Catherine the Great spoke of it as New Russia. But what that New Russia, that idea of a New Russia does, is that it blurs away, it obliterates everything that came before. If power is able to say what is new, then power is also able to dismiss what is old. And then suddenly when power says always, they mean just since we took everything ourselves. But the Crimean Khanate was a very important state. It lasted for longer than the United States of America has lasted so far. For quite a long time, it was more important than Moscow It was Moscow that was paying tribute to Crimea until 1699 and not the other way around. The Crimean Khanate was deeply engaged with other European powers, the Poles, the Lithuanians, for centuries. So the Crimean history is deep and it's real. The Crimean Khanate had political institutions. It had the leader who was called the Khan. It had a deputy to the leader. It had a representative body called the Kurultai. We know a good deal about the Crimean Khanate. We know a good deal about all of these continuities. But when the Crimean Khanate was destroyed and Crimea was taken by the Russians, this operation was carried out to try to make everything disappear. Under the heading of New Russia, names were replaced. Old Turkic names were replaced with new ones. New cities were built with names that really didn't make sense in the surroundings. Scientists were sent to reclassify the land to give everything new names. The land itself was given away to Russians. When the Crimean Khanate fell in the late 18th century, there were basically no Russians there at all. Now Russians were sent, and they built palaces in European styles. And all of this was part of an attempt to create something new, a new territory which could be part of this new Russia. But again, when an empire says that something is new, what they mean is that they're trying to do away with everything that is old. When the Russian Empire itself came to an end in 1917, there was a petition by the representatives of the Crimean people to the League of Nations for the League of Nations to choose a power who would take responsibility for Crimea so that Crimea might be brought out of all of the complicated civil wars and revolutions that were underway at the time. But in fact, Crimea came under Bolshevik power. Crimea became an autonomous republic of the Russian Republic of the Soviet Union. And this was because at the time, everyone recognized, even Soviet leaders recognized, that Crimea was something special. Sure, much of the native population was gone. About a third of it had fled when the Russian Empire took over Crimea in the late 18th century. More of the native population fled during the Crimean Wars of the middle of the 19th century. By the early 20th century, Crimean Tatars, who had been almost 100% of the population, were less than 50%. But nevertheless, even Soviet leaders had to recognize that Crimea was special. And so it was given this special status as an autonomous republic. During the Second World War, the reason for this status was removed, because during the Second World War, Stalin removed all of the remaining Crimean Tatars, all of them. Every last man, woman, and child was deported in the spring of 1944 in an operation which lasted only 3 days. Mechanized, organized, absolute, and complete. All of the Crimean Tatar population was removed, most of them to Soviet Uzbekistan. The idea in Stalin's mind was that everyone was a collaborator. This is a familiar idea coming from Moscow. Everyone else is guilty. Everyone else has to do with the Nazis, just not us. But of course, it's absurd to apply this notion of collective guilt to an entire population. It was applied even to Crimean Tatar soldiers who were returning from the front, where they had helped to liberate Berlin. Everyone, because of ethnicity, was deported. And this meant that after the Second World War, there was no special reason any longer for Crimea to be an autonomous republic. The Crimeans themselves had been forcibly removed. And so there was a discussion about what to do with this region, which was resolved in 1956 when Khrushchev decided that Crimea would be part of Ukraine rather than part of Russia. 1954. In this discussion, nobody asked the Crimeans. This discussion was all about Russia and Ukraine. Soviet Russia had a big problem with Soviet Ukraine. Soviet Ukraine had suffered tremendously from famine and from terror in the 1930s. Ukrainians had resisted Soviet rule in Western Ukraine into the late 1940s. Khrushchev was very knowledgeable about this. So what Khrushchev did was he took an administrative decision and covered it up in a kind of national politics. The administrative decision was, we're going to add Crimea to Ukraine because from Ukraine we can get water and electricity. And the national covering was to say, look, Ukrainians, we're giving you this wonderful gift. And this gift was commemorated at the time with all kinds of consumer goods and so on, so that it would seem as though Russia was doing, or the Soviet Union was doing something for Ukraine. But no one asked the Crimeans, and the Crimeans couldn't come back. They couldn't come back, that is, until the end of the Soviet Union, the very end, the last few years, the Gorbachev period, and then after the end of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. Incredibly, in the 1990s and in the early 21st century, Crimeans returned from Uzbekistan. Crimean Tatars or their children or grandchildren returned from Uzbekistan to Crimea. And despite difficulties and despite resistance from much of the local population, they were able to settle. Why resistance from the local population? Because Crimea had become a very imperial territory. In the 19th century, land was given to Russian nobles. In the 20th century, in the Soviet Union, land in pleasant, warm Crimea was given to people retiring from the armed forces and other Soviet dignitaries, the result of which is that it became a kind of imperial territory. Even so, Crimeans managed to find their way back. Even so, Crimea was part of Ukraine. Most of the population voted for independence in 1991. This was all disrupted in 2014 when Russia, now independent Russia, invaded Ukraine, now independent Ukraine, for the first time. Once again, Crimean Tatars had to flee their homeland. This time, many of them fled northwards to the rest of Ukraine. Under Russia, since 2014, Crimean Tatars have lost the political representation they had in independent Ukraine. They've lost most of the civil society that was allowed in independent Ukraine, and dozens of Crimean Tatars have been imprisoned as political prisoners for essentially nothing other than what they've written or what they've said in Russia. There are a very large number of Crimean Tatar political prisoners serving very long terms in the Russian Federation right now. When Russia invaded in 2022, matters became worse. Crimeans fled again to Ukraine, fearing even worse treatment, which they were right to fear. The Russian army has been selectively mobilizing Crimean Tatar men in the hope that they will die in Ukraine, just as the Russian army in general has been mobilizing its national minorities, its indigenous people, all across the territory of Russia as part of this imperial war. So again, I'm saying things in this little lecture that I believe everyone in Crimea knows, everyone attending the festival knows, but I'm saying what's on my mind as a historian who works on this region and as a citizen of a country in the West, because I think it's very important for people to understand that this war against Ukraine was imperial in 2022. The idea that Ukraine doesn't exist is a terrible colonial idea. The idea that Ukrainians and Russians were always one people is a terrible colonial idea. But in 2014, the idea that Crimea was always Russia was the same terrible colonial idea. If we accept that somehow Crimea doesn't have its own history, the next step is to accept that Ukraine doesn't have its own history. But Ukraine and Crimea do have their own histories, and Ukrainians and Crimeans have the right to live without the kind of colonial treatment which they're receiving now. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you. I wish you much prosperity in the festival, and I wish Crimeans very well. Thank you.